4 weeks after announcing his budget repair bill proposal, Governor Walker signed the amended version into law on Friday.
We just had a ceremonial signing. I officially signed Act 11 into law, Act 10 into law this morning at approximately 9:30. That measure was taken over to the Secretary of State's office. He has signed it, and we're awaiting publication of that, which routinely, when requested, is done in the next working day. He has up to 10 working days to do it, but routinely in the past it's been done upon request within 1 working day, and it's our hope that that tradition in state government will continue. Setting aside the procedure, though, because really that's what we need to talk about today. We face a tough time in this state. A tough economy, a tight budget, just like tight budgets all across this country. We were elected to make tough decisions last November to ensure that we didn't pass these tough decisions onto our children and the next generation, and that's exactly what we've done here today. In fact, in the first 5 to 6 weeks we were in office, we passed some of the most aggressive economic development, pro-job initiatives in the entire country, and on almost every one of those measures we passed them on a bipartisan vote, showing that Republicans and Democrats can work together to get the people of this state working, knowing that jobs aren't about Republican jobs or Democrat jobs, they're about Wisconsin jobs. And talking about that even in the 2 months leading to our taking office, I think it's already shown some positive results. The other day, on Wednesday, we announced through the Department of Workforce Development that there are ultimately, we've seen more than 10,000 new jobs being created in the private sector in the first month of this year. We've dropped the unemployment rate to 7.4%. It is still too high, but it is much lower than the national average, and that is good news. And I'm looking forward to us continuing down that path, and I'm welcoming any Democrats that want to join with the Republicans here in the legislature to get back on course to get this state working again. But today I want to talk about the budget reforms that are included in the measure I signed into law. These are budget reforms that really help us in 3 key areas. First off, these reforms, budget reforms, help us protect middle-class jobs and middle-class taxpayers. You see, a month ago today, I stood in this room at approximately the same spot after having briefed the Democrat leaders in the State Assembly and the State Senate, Representative Peter Barca and Senator Miller, in my office just back behind her. I gave them an update in advance, just as I talked to Senator Fitzgerald and Speaker Fitzgerald about what was in this bill and what we were proposing to move this state forward. What we talked about then is what we're talking about today, and that is true reform that protects middle-class jobs. I said at that point we anticipated $30 million worth of savings if we started at the beginning of April, making a 5.8% contribution to the pension system and a 12.6% contribution to our health insurance premiums. Contributions, which I might add, are well below what middle-class taxpayers are paying all across the state. I mentioned my brother at the time, a guy who is, he and his family are typical of middle-class families all across the state. My brother David mentioned at the time, he runs he's the banquet manager at a hotel, works part-time as a bartender. His wife works for a department store. They have 2 wonderful kids. He's a typical middle-class family in this state. And what he mentioned at that time is he's paying some $800 each month to cover his health care costs and a little bit he can set aside for his 401k. He'd love, like just about every other middle-class worker in the state, love to have what we pay even under this bill, under this new law when it comes to pension and health care contributions. This is a very modest request in order for us to balance the budget. And in doing so, what I mentioned back then is if we didn't have this, we would have the equivalent of 1,500 jobs laid off at the beginning of April. What we have done through this bill, through the courageous leadership of the State Assembly and the State Senate joining with us, what we have done together is save 1,500 middle-class jobs through the remainder of this year and anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 middle-class jobs over the next 2 years, because we give not only the state government but local governments the tools they need to balance their budgets. That's incredibly important because all across this country, state after state is facing massive deficits. In states with Democrat as well as Republican governors, they're cutting billions of dollars for our schools, for local governments, for other levels of government, and ultimately not giving them the tools they need. So in essence, they're forcing them to do one of 2 things. Either pass that on in terms of massive layoffs of teachers and other government employees and reductions in service, or look at massive property tax increases, or in many cases, both. Those options to me are unacceptable. What we're doing here in Wisconsin is leading the way with a better alternative. We are providing a better alternative that says you don't have to have massive tax increases on the middle class, and you don't have to have massive layoffs to balance a budget. Instead, what we're offering are modest reforms when it comes to wages and benefits in state and local government. And by giving our local governments those tools, they can balance the budget and avoid those sorts of poor choices in the future. Secondly, this is about making government work better. In other states that have done this, most recently, back in 2005, Governor Mitch Daniels did this in Indiana. And in the years since, we've seen in Indiana government runs more efficiently, more effectively. It's more accountable to the people they serve. It ultimately makes things work better. I mentioned this the other day. You know, a year ago, we had a teacher that was awarded the Outstanding New Teacher of the Year, and a week later, she got a layoff notice because her local school district had a collective bargaining agreement that was based on seniority, not based on merit or performance. This measure that I just signed into law gives local governments, and particularly schools, the ability to put the best and the brightest, to make decisions based on performance and merit, not just based on seniority and a union contract. And ultimately, that's why the last benefit of this measure is that we ultimately reward good employees. Again, just as they've done in Indiana, they've seen the last several years since they changed and reformed collective bargaining like we're proposing here today, that employees continued to see increases that were proportionate with where everybody else in society and their income. And most importantly, some of the best and the brightest received additional incentives because they could single them out for the effective work that they were doing in their government. This is about protecting middle-class jobs and protecting middle-class taxpayers. It's ultimately about making government work better for the people we are elected to serve, and it's ultimately about rewarding good and decent employees. And I should add, I said this a month ago, and I've said it every day since. There are good, decent people who work in government at the state and the local level. There are people who are professionals, who we respect, who day in and day out, more than 300,000, have come to work and done their job just as they were asked, who want nothing more than the chance to do the job that they love, and we're going to continue to allow them to do this under this measure. We want to thank them for that, and we respect them for that. This bill has never been about anything negative towards them. It's been about moving this state forward and protecting the jobs of their co-workers. Ultimately, this new law is about our commitment to the future. Our commitment to the future so our children don't face the dire consequences we face today. Some have asked whether or not this is going to set a national precedent. I don't know. The answer remains in the states around the country. But what I can tell you is back in the 1990s, Tommy Thompson, when I had the honor of serving the legislature, took on the status quo when it came to welfare. He led the way in Wisconsin when it came to welfare reform. And because of his leadership in this state, we became a national leader for welfare reform, so much so that President Clinton eventually adopted many of the same principles we adopted here in the great state of Wisconsin. For us, we're doing this to lead the way in our own state, to get Wisconsin working again. But if along the way we help lead a movement across the state to pass true fiscal reform, true budgetary reform, to ultimately inspire others across this country, state by state and in our federal government, inspire others to stand up and make the tough decisions so that they too make a commitment to the future, so that our children in all states and across the country ultimately don't have to face the dire consequences we face because previous leaders have failed to stand up and lead. I think that's a good thing and a thing we're willing to accept as part of our legacy. In the end, though, this bill goes back to what we said when we ran for office last fall. Not just for me, but other elected officials here today. We talked about what it took to get Wisconsin working again. To get Wisconsin working takes a commitment to help the private sector create more jobs in our state, and we have an ongoing commitment to help our private employers, our job creators, put more than 250,000 more people to work over the next 4 years. But to do that, it also means we have to have a stable government and a stable budget. And in our measure today, we help take the first step towards putting in place a government that is stable not only for the next several months and not only for the next 2 years, but a government at both the state and the local level that will be stable for generations to come.